Edwin Marshall sat on his weathered porch, the wood creaking beneath his rocking chair as he surveyed what remained of Esperanza, Texas. His gnarled hands, marked with liver spots and crisscrossed with old scars, gripped a pair of military-grade binoculars, a relic from another era, just like him. At 88 years old, Edwin's body may have betrayed him in many ways, but his eyes remained sharp as ever. The small border town that had been his home for over 60 years now felt like foreign territory. Through his binoculars, he watched unfamiliar black SUVs with tinted windows cruise down Main Street, their drivers eyeing the locals with predatory interest. Edwin's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face constricting around a lifetime of discipline. "Another one," he muttered, making a notation in the leather-bound journal beside him. 3 months of observations filled its pages, license plates, times, faces when visible. A soldier's reconnaissance, methodical and thorough. Edwin set down the binoculars and ran his hand over the worn silver dog tags that hung around his neck. They'd once belonged to his best friend, Charlie Winters, who never made it past Omaha Beach in 1944. Sometimes Edwin wondered if Charlie had gotten the better deal, not living long enough to see how the world had changed. A sharp pain lanced through Edwin's hip as he stood, forcing him to reach for his walnut cane, hand-carved from wood taken from his own property. He refused to use those aluminum contraptions that marked men as infirm. This cane had weight, substance. Like its owner, it had endured. The smell of brewing coffee drifted from inside his modest ranch house, a single-story structure he'd built with his own hands in 1957 with the help of his wife, Margaret. She'd been gone 12 years now, cancer taking her as efficiently as German bullets had taken his friends. The house sat on 20 acres at the edge of town, elevated enough to provide a strategic view of Esperanza's main thoroughfare. Edwin made his way inside, each step a negotiation between willpower and pain. The interior remained largely unchanged since Margaret's passing, faded floral wallpaper, sturdy oak furniture built to last, and countless framed photographs documenting a life well lived. Most prominent was their wedding photo, Edwin in his pressed army uniform, the silver star and purple heart visible on his chest, Margaret radiant in a simple white dress, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant bun. "Morning, Maggie," he said to the photograph, a ritual unchanged by the passage of years. The coffee pot gurgled its final protests as Edwin poured the black liquid into his Marine Corps mug, a gift from his friend Victor Ramirez, who'd served in Korea. The handle was chipped but still functional, like most things in Edwin's life. He carried his coffee to what Margaret had once called his war room, though she'd always said it with a gentle smile. The spare bedroom had been transformed into a study, walls covered with maps of Esperanza and the surrounding county. Red pins marked confirmed cartel locations. Blue pins indicated sympathetic households. There were fewer of those each month. Yellow pins represented neutral territory, businesses and homes that hadn't yet been forced to choose sides. The map told a story of occupation as clear as any Edwin had seen in war-torn European villages. His fingers traced a path from the southern border, following the routes the cartel used to transport their poison into America. Unlike the frontal assaults he'd faced in the war, this invasion had been insidious, beginning with small incursions, tests of resistance met with bureaucratic indifference from authorities too overwhelmed or corrupted to respond effectively. The telephone rang, its old-fashioned bell cutting through the morning quiet. Edwin checked his watch, 0700 hours exactly. Victor was punctual, a habit the Marines had drilled into him. "Marshall," Edwin answered, military brevity never quite leaving his speech. "Morning, you old warhorse," Victor's gravelly voice replied. "You still coming to the meeting tonight?" Edwin glanced at his calendar where a simple notation read VFW 1900. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall was one of the few places in town not yet infiltrated by cartel influence. "Affirmative," Edwin replied. "Who else is confirmed?" "The usual suspects. Jackson's bringing his grandson home from the hospital today, so he's out." Edwin frowned. Thomas Jackson's grandson, barely 17, had been beaten severely 3 days ago after refusing to serve as a lookout for cartel operations. The official police report called it a random mugging. "How's the boy?" "Broken ribs, broken arm, concussion. He'll live, but Tom's talking about sending him to relatives in Oklahoma." Another family torn apart. Another piece of Esperanza lost. "Tell Tom I'll stop by tomorrow," Edwin said. "Anything else I should know before tonight?" A pause lingered on the line. "Word is they're moving something big through town this weekend." Mendoza's crew cleared out the old Peterson's barn on the south property. James Peterson had sold his family farm 6 months ago after his tractor mysteriously caught fire. The official cause was listed as an electrical malfunction. "I'll do some recon," Edwin said. "See you at 1900. After hanging up, Edwin returned to his maps, adding a new notation at the Peterson property. The pattern was expanding, cartel operations growing bolder as resistance dwindled. Edwin finished his coffee and moved to his bedroom. He knelt with difficulty beside his bed, ignoring the protest of arthritic joints, and pulled out an old military footlocker. The combination lock clicked open to reveal his most private possessions. On top lay his service uniform, meticulously preserved. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was his M1 Garand rifle, the same one he'd carried across France and into Germany. He didn't touch it, merely confirmed its presence before relocking the trunk. Edwin showered and dressed with military precision khaki pants with a sharp crease, a plaid button-down shirt, polished brown shoes. His white hair was combed back from his deeply lined face, revealing pale blue eyes that had lost none of their intensity. The routine brought comfort, order imposed on a world increasingly chaotic. By 0800, Edwin was in his 1998 Ford F-150, the engine rumbling to life with reassuring reliability. The truck, like its owner, was older but meticulously maintained and still capable. He drove methodically through town, maintaining exactly the speed limit, noting changes since yesterday. The for sale sign on the Miller property was gone, replaced by unfamiliar men unloading furniture. The hardware store had new security cameras installed. The diner where he'd eaten breakfast with Margaret every Sunday for 40 years now had tinted windows and a new name, Oro Verde, green gold. A mocking reference to the marijuana that had been the cartel's first business before they expanded into harder drugs, human trafficking, and extortion. Edwin parked in front of the post office, one of the few federal buildings in town. Inside, he nodded to Mary Dawson, who'd been postmistress since before Edwin's hair had turned white. "Morning, Edwin," she said, her voice lower than usual. "Your magazines came in." She slid a bundle across the counter, American Legion Monthly, Guns and Ammo, and Military History Quarterly. Beneath them was a folded note. Edwin pocketed the note without reading it. "Thank you, Mary. How's David doing at college?" Mary's smile tightened. "He's decided to stay in Austin for the summer. Says there are better job opportunities there." They both knew it wasn't about jobs. Mary's son wouldn't be coming home because home wasn't safe anymore. "Smart boy," Edwin said. "You raised him well." Back in his truck, Edwin unfolded the note. Mary's neat handwriting listed 3 new license plates with timestamps from yesterday. Her late husband had been Air Force, a navigator on B-52S during Vietnam. She understood the importance of intelligence. Edwin drove to the edge of town, taking a circuitous route that passed the Peterson barn. A new chain-link fence surrounded the property, topped with razor wire. 2 men with visible sidearms stood by the gate. They watched Edwin's truck with undisguised suspicion as he drove past at a leisurely pace. Just another old man out for a drive. He continued to the county cemetery where Margaret was buried. It was his alibi if anyone questioned his movements, a widower visiting his wife's grave. But it was more than that. He needed to talk to her, to somehow justify what he was considering. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill overlooking Esperanza. Edwin parked and made his slow way to Margaret's headstone, a simple marble marker inscribed with her name, dates, and the words beloved wife, teacher, guardian angel. Edwin lowered himself onto the small bench he'd installed beside her grave. "Things are getting worse, Maggie," he said softly. They've taken over most of downtown now. The sheriff looks the other way. The feds are too stretched thin along the border. A warm breeze rustled through the oak trees that dotted the cemetery. I know what you're thinking, that I'm too old for this fight, that my war ended in 1945. He smiled ruefully. You always could read my mind. Birds chirped in the branches above, peaceful sounds at odds with the turmoil in Edwin's heart. I made you a promise, remember? The night before I shipped out. I promised I'd come back and keep you safe. And I did, for 58 years. His voice cracked slightly. I couldn't stop the cancer. But this, he gestured toward the town below. This is something I understand. An enemy I can see. Edwin sat in silence for several minutes, gathering his thoughts and his resolve. There are others like me in town. Men who faced worse odds. Who remember what it means to fight for something that matters. He touched the headstone gently. I think it's time, Maggie. One last mission. As Edwin stood to leave, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A text message from Victor. Powell's store hit this morning. Minor damage. Warning shot. John Powell's general store had been in his family for 3 generations. He'd refused to pay protection money last month. Edwin's jaw set in a hard line as he walked back to his truck, his grip tight on his cane. The decision had been made, not in anger, but with the cold calculation of a soldier who knows that sometimes violence is the only language an enemy understands. By the time Edwin returned home, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his property. He spent an hour checking his perimeter, old habits from a lifetime ago, reinforced by new necessity. The motion sensors he'd installed along his fence line were operational. The shotgun above his fireplace was loaded with buckshot. The emergency radio in his kitchen was charged. Basic security measures, but they brought some peace of mind. At 1800 hours, Edwin prepared for the meeting. He retrieved a small fireproof safe from his closet and opened it using a key he kept on a chain around his neck alongside Charlie's dog tags. Inside were documents he'd been gathering for months, property records showing the cartel's acquisition of local businesses through shell companies, photographs taken surreptitiously of drug handoffs, transcripts of conversations recorded when cartel members spoke too freely at the diner. Evidence that law enforcement had shown little interest in, but which might prove useful in other ways. Edwin secured the documents in a weathered leather briefcase that had once belonged to his father. As he closed the safe, his eyes fell on another item, a faded photograph of his platoon taken in England before D-Day. 40 young men in uniform, standing at attention. Only 16 would return home. Edwin had been their sergeant, responsible for their training, their readiness, ultimately their lives. He'd carried the weight of those who didn't make it for 78 years. The faces of the dead visited him still in dreams, asking if he'd done everything possible to prepare them. Now, approaching 90, Edwin Marshall was preparing for another war. Different enemy, different terrain, but the principles remained the same. Know your objective, know your enemy, know your capabilities. At precisely 1845, Edwin locked his house and got into his truck. The VFW hall was on the outskirts of town, a simple one-story building with an American flag flying out front. 6 other vehicles were already parked in the lot when he arrived. He recognized them all. Inside, the main meeting room had been cleared except for a large round table. 7 men sat waiting, ranging in age from 65 to 91. They represented a living timeline of American military history, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm. Different wars, different experiences, united by a common understanding of duty. Victor Ramirez, 79, nodded as Edwin entered. His Korean War service had left him with a pronounced limp and a silver star for valor under fire. Beside him sat Michael Chin, 68, who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat medic and still volunteered at the county hospital. Robert Williams, 73, a former Marine sniper in Vietnam, sat cleaning his glasses with methodical precision. His hands, steady as stone, had once been legendary for their accuracy with a rifle. George Blackhawk, 6'5", had served in the First Gulf War as an Army intelligence specialist. His Comanche heritage was evident in his deeply lined face and long gray hair pulled back in a traditional braid. William Foster, 86, had been a Navy radioman in Korea, maintaining communications under heavy fire. His expertise with electronics had transitioned into civilian life as the town's electrician until his retirement. And finally, Frank Delgado, 91, who'd fought in the Pacific Theater during World War II and still moved with the ramrod straight posture of a career military man despite his advanced age. These men had once been the backbone of Esperanza, business owners, civic leaders, coaches, and mentors. Now they were its last line of defense. "Gentlemen," Edwin said, taking his seat at the table. "Thank you for coming." Victor nodded toward the door, where Philip Martinez, George's son-in-law and Esperanza's only remaining honest deputy sheriff, stood guard. Young by their standards at Fort 2, Philip had served in Afghanistan and understood what was at stake. "We're secure," Victor confirmed. "No electronic devices." Philip swept the room. Edwin opened his briefcase and spread out his maps and documents. The other men leaned forward, military training evident in their posture and focus. "The situation has deteriorated faster than anticipated," Edwin began, his voice steady. "John Powell's store was vandalized this morning. Thomas Jackson's grandson is hospitalized. The Peterson property has been fortified, likely as a distribution center." He pointed to specific locations on the map as he spoke. "Our community is being systematically dismantled. Law enforcement is compromised. Federal assistance is minimal and reactive rather than proactive." The men around the table nodded grimly. They'd seen the same pattern developing. "Tonight," Edwin continued, "I'm asking you to consider a course of action that I do not suggest lightly." He looked each man in the eye, one by one. "We are old men. Most of us have lived full lives. Some might say our fighting days are behind us." A humorless smile crossed his weathered face. "I disagree. Age has taken some of our strength, but none of our resolve. What we lack in physical capability, we more than compensate for in experience." Edwin tapped the map with a gnarled finger. "The cartels believe they can take our town because we are weak, because we will submit rather than fight. They have mistaken our restraint for weakness, our patience for fear." He straightened in his chair, and for a moment, the decades fell away. The others saw not an 88-year-old man, but Sergeant Edwin Marshall of the 29th Infantry Division, the young NCO who'd led men across bloody beaches and through hedgerows against a determined enemy. "I propose we demonstrate how mistaken they are." The veterans' meeting lasted well past midnight, strategies debated with the precision of men who understood that plans rarely survived first contact with the enemy. By the time Edwin drove home, the moon hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the empty streets of Esperanza. He took an indirect route, watching for followers, another habit from a lifetime ago. His headlights swept across the town's water tower, where fresh graffiti displayed the stylized scorpion that had become the calling card of the Los Alacranes cartel. The symbol made Edwin's jaw tighten. Territorial markings, like animals claiming new hunting grounds. At his property, Edwin performed another perimeter check before entering his home. Nothing disturbed, no signs of intrusion. Still, he slept lightly, his father's Remington shotgun within arm's reach beside his bed. Dawn broke with the harsh clarity common to the Texas borderlands, brilliant light cutting across the landscape, turning the distant mountains purple against the horizon. Edwin rose with the sun, his body protesting, but his mind clear. Today would begin the next phase, active reconnaissance. He dressed in unassuming clothes, faded jeans, a Texas Rangers baseball cap, and a light jacket despite the growing heat. The jacket concealed a small .38 revolver, a relic from his time as mayor, when he'd been issued a concealed carry permit that had never expired. Not his preferred weapon, but less conspicuous than the Garand. Edwin ate breakfast with deliberate calm, 2 eggs, toast, black coffee. The ritual of routine steadied him as he reviewed the assignments distributed at last night's meeting. Each veteran had taken responsibility for specific intelligence-gathering tasks. His own mission would take him to Powell's general store. The store stood at the intersection of Main Street and Cottonwood Drive, a cornerstone of Esperanza's small business district since 1932. As Edwin parked across the street, he could see John Powell sweeping up broken glass from the sidewalk in front of his establishment. The store's front window had been shattered, and spray-painted across the brick facade was another scorpion symbol with the word aviso beneath it. Warning. Edwin crossed the street, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the pavement. Powell looked up, relief evident on his face at the sight of a friendly presence. "Morning, John," Edwin said, surveying the damage with a practiced eye. "Quite a mess." Powell, a sturdy man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair, leaned on his broom. "Happened around 2 this morning. Security camera caught 3 men, faces covered. In and out in less than 2 minutes. Edwin nodded, noting the precision of the operation. "They take anything?" "That's the thing. They didn't. Just broke the window, sprayed their tag, and left." Powell lowered his voice. "But they left this inside." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small plastic bag containing a single bullet, a .50 caliber round, big enough to punch through engine blocks. "A heavy message." "You reported?" Edwin asked, already knowing the answer. Powell's bitter laugh confirmed it. "Sheriff Vegas sent Deputy Rodriguez. Took some photos, said it was probably youth vandalism, suggested I invest in better security." He spat on the ground. "Rodriguez's cousin is one of Mendoza's lieutenants. Everyone knows it." Edwin pocketed the bullet. "Mind if I look at your security footage?" Inside, the store smelled of coffee and sawdust. A temporary piece of plywood covered the broken window, casting the interior in shadow. Powell led Edwin to a small office in the back where a desktop computer displayed grainy black and white footage from the previous night. Edwin watched with a soldier's eye for detail. 3 men, military-grade tactical vests despite the warm night, moving with coordinated efficiency. Not common criminals. Trained personnel. "Can you copy this to a flash drive?" Edwin asked. Powell nodded. "Already done. I made copies for the sheriff too, not that it'll matter." Edwin pocketed the drive. "Who else have they approached in town?" "Martinez at the pharmacy, Rodriguez at the hardware store, Gutierrez at the garage." Powell counted them off on his fingers. "They're working through the whole business district. 20% of gross earnings for protection. Anyone who refuses gets this." He gestured toward the broken window, "or worse." "And people are paying?" "Most are." "What choice do they have?" "We're 2 hours from the nearest state police outpost. Border Patrol is stretched thin. Even if the sheriff wasn't in their pocket, what could he do against these numbers?" Powell's shoulders slumped. "My father built this store. My grandfather before him. I'm not giving it up, but I've sent Elaine and the kids to her sisters in Dallas." Edwin clasped the younger man's shoulder. "You've done right by your family, John. As for the store," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Help may be coming sooner than you think." Powell's eyes narrowed. "What kind of help?" "The kind that understands what we're dealing with," Edwin replied. "Keep your head down for now. If anyone asks about me being here, I was just checking on an old friend." Outside, Edwin continued his reconnaissance, moving through town with the unhurried pace of an elderly man with nowhere particular to be. He passed the pharmacy where Luis Martinez was installing new security gates, the hardware store where the prices had mysteriously increased by 20% overnight, the elementary school where attendance had dropped by half as families fled the growing danger. At the town's small park, Edwin sat on a bench overlooking the playground. Once filled with children's laughter, it now stood empty, the swings moving gently in the hot breeze. He opened a small notebook and made careful notations about what he'd observed: security measures, businesses affected, personnel identified. A black SUV with tinted windows cruised past, slowing as it reached the park. Edwin continued writing, seemingly oblivious but tracking the vehicle with his peripheral vision, an old sniper's trick. The SUV stopped. 2 men emerged, both in their 30s, with the hard physiques of those who'd learned strength in prisons rather than gymnasiums. They approached Edwin's bench with deliberate steps. He continued writing, his posture relaxed, only looking up when their shadows fell across his notebook. "Buenos dias, senor," the taller one said, his tone falsely respectful. "Beautiful day? No?" Edwin nodded, his expression pleasant but guarded. "Indeed it is. We notice you walking around town, taking notes." The man gestured toward Edwin's notebook. "You a writer, perhaps?" "Historian. Just an old man with a poor memory," Edwin replied, closing the notebook. "I write things down so I don't forget." He tapped his temple with a weathered finger. "Not as sharp as it used to be." The second man, shorter but more heavily muscled, with a teardrop tattoo beneath his left eye, spoke for the first time. "What things you write, viejo? About the town? About the people in it?" Edwin met the man's gaze without flinching. "Mostly about the weather. Bird migrations. Changes in the landscape. I was mayor here, once upon a time. Like to keep track of how things develop." The first man smiled, showing gold-capped teeth. "A mayor? Very impressive. You must care about this town very much." "I do," Edwin said simply. "It's been my home for 60 years. Then you want it to prosper?" "Yes. To be safe." The man spread his hands. "This is what we want too. Safety, prosperity, progress." Edwin nodded. "Admirable goals. Though we might define progress differently." The smile vanished from the man's face. "What is your name, old one?" "Edwin Marshall." The men exchanged glances, a flash of recognition passing between them. The shorter one whispered something in Spanish. "Ah, Senor Marshall, the war hero." The taller man's tone shifted slightly. "My employer has mentioned you. A man of principles, he says." Edwin's expression remained neutral. "Your employer knows me?" "He knows everyone of importance in Esperanza. He is a great admirer of history, of men who have served their country." The man's smile returned, not reaching his eyes. "Perhaps you would join him for dinner sometime. He would value your perspective on the town's future." A clear attempt to assess Edwin's position, to determine whether he represented a threat or a potential ally. Edwin decided to play for time. "I'd be honored," he lied smoothly, "though my social calendar isn't what it once was." The taller man withdrew a business card and placed it on the bench beside Edwin. "When you are free, call this number. Ask for Alejandro. My employer will make time for a man of your distinction." The card was expensive, heavy stock with embossed lettering. "Luis Mendoza, Import-Export. A legitimate business front for illegitimate operations." "I'll do that," Edwin said, pocketing the card. "Please thank your employer for his interest." The men departed, returning to their SUV. Edwin remained on the bench, maintaining his relaxed posture until they had driven out of sight. Only then did he allow himself a deep breath, releasing the tension he concealed. The encounter confirmed what he'd suspected. The cartel was watching him, aware of his background. The invitation was both a recruitment attempt and a warning: join us or stand aside. Edwin had no intention of doing either. He continued his circuit of the town, gathering information while maintaining the appearance of an elderly man on a morning constitutional. Near noon, he made his way to St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Father Gabriel Torres had served the community for over 20 years. The church's whitewashed walls gleamed in the midday sun, the bell tower rising above the surrounding buildings like a sentinel. Edwin found Father Gabriel in the garden behind the rectory, tending to tomato plants with careful hands. "Edwin," the priest greeted him warmly. "It's been too long since you visited." Edwin smiled, genuine affection in his expression. Gabriel had been a close friend of Margaret's, officiating at her funeral and checking on Edwin regularly in the months after her passing. "I've been preoccupied, Father. The town has changed." Gabriel's expression grew somber. "Yes, not for the better, I'm afraid." He gestured toward a bench in the shade of an old oak tree. "Sit with me. My bones aren't what they used to be." The two men settled on the bench, speaking quietly despite the privacy of the garden. "The cartel approached me last week," Gabriel said without preamble. "They offered a donation to the church building fund. $50,000. Edwin's eyebrows rose. "Generous. What did you tell them?" That the church appreciates all legitimate contributions but cannot accept funds from sources that harm our community. Gabriel sighed. They were not pleased. Have they threatened you? Not directly, but attendance at Mass has declined. People are afraid to be seen speaking with me. The priest's eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, showed more weariness than fear. I've heard confessions, Edwin. People terrified of losing their livelihoods, their homes. Young men being recruited or coerced. Women, he broke off, the restrictions of the confessional sealing his lips. Edwin understood the unspoken. The authorities? Gabriel shook his head. Sheriff Vega suggested I focus on spiritual matters and leave civic concerns to him. The bishop in El Paso advised caution and patience. His voice hardened slightly. But there comes a point when patience becomes complicity. Yes, Edwin agreed. There does. I've heard whispers, Gabriel continued, about you and the other veterans. About meetings at the VFW hall. Edwin remained silent, neither confirming nor denying. Whatever you're planning, Gabriel said carefully, know that not all battles can be won with weapons. Some require faith, community, the strength of unified purpose. I haven't forgotten, Edwin assured him. But faith without action is hollow. Gabriel nodded slowly. True. And action without righteousness is merely violence. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. If you're gathering intelligence, this may help. The paper contained a list of names, families who had fled Esperanza in recent weeks, properties that had changed hands, businesses now suspected of laundering cartel money. The confessional is sacred, Gabriel explained, but much is said outside its bounds. People trust their priest with more than just their sins. Edwin studied the list, noting several properties he hadn't known about. This is valuable, Father. Thank you. I cannot condone violence, Gabriel said, his voice firm. But neither can I stand by while evil consumes what we've built here. He clasped Edwin's hand. Whatever path you choose, walk it with clear eyes and a pure heart. Edwin departed with the list securely in his pocket. His respect for the priest deepened. Gabriel was fighting his own battle against the cartel, not with weapons, but with moral authority and the strength of his convictions. By mid-afternoon, Edwin had completed his reconnaissance circuit and returned to his truck. As he reached for the door handle, he noticed a small rectangle of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. Checking his surroundings first, he retrieved it. A photograph, printed on glossy paper. Edwin's house, taken from the road. Written across the bottom in red marker. Even heroes die, viejo. A crude intimidation tactic, but effective in its way. They knew where he lived. Were watching his movements. The implied threat was clear. Edwin pocketed the photograph and drove to Victor Ramirez's auto repair shop on the east side of town. The garage's weathered exterior belied its importance as the veterans' secondary meeting location, chosen for its privacy and defensible position. Victor was beneath a lifted pickup truck when Edwin arrived, but emerged at the sound of the visitor's footsteps, wiping grease from his hands. Despite his 7 to 9 years, Victor's arms remained corded with muscle from decades of mechanical work. "Got your message," Victor said, leading Edwin into a small office at the back of the shop. "You had company at the park." Edwin nodded. "You saw." Michael was positioned at the diner across the street. "Got photographs." Victor gestured toward a manila envelope on his cluttered desk. The tall one is Javier Reyes, Mendoza's lieutenant. The other is Diego Fuentes, enforcement specialist. Specialist, Edwin repeated with a humorless smile. A fancy term for thug. Not just any thug, Victor cautioned. Fuentes was Mexican Special Forces before being discharged for disciplinary reasons. Rumored to have been trained at the School of the Americas in Georgia. He knows his business. Edwin processed this information with growing concern. Not just criminals, then, but men with proper military training. The challenge was escalating. "They left me this," he said, showing Victor the photograph of his house. Victor whistled softly. Subtle. About as subtle as a hand grenade. Edwin sat heavily in a creaking chair. "They're establishing their dominance, testing our resolve. And and I'm not impressed. Edwin spread his various notes on the desk, his own observations, Father Gabriel's list, the security footage from Powell's store. They're organized. Yes. Dangerous, certainly. But they're also overconfident, making assumptions about the town, about us. Victor examined the assembled intelligence. Assumptions that were too old, too few, too weak to resist. Exactly. Edwin tapped the photograph from his windshield. This isn't the strategy of someone who sees us as a serious threat. It's the behavior of bullies who expect compliance through intimidation. They're underestimating us, Victor said, a grim smile forming beneath his salt and pepper mustache. A mistake we can use. Edwin leaned forward. What's the status of our other objectives? Victor pulled a map from his desk drawer, unfolding it to display Esperanza and the surrounding county. Various locations were marked with coded symbols, safe houses, observation posts, potential targets. Robert has established 3 sniper positions covering the main approaches to town. George has our communications network ready, shortwave radios, frequency rotation schedule. Michael has assembled medical supplies. William has modified some of his electrical equipment for our purposes. Victor's euphemism referenced the improvised devices William Foster had been designing. Not bombs, exactly, but creative applications of his electrical engineering skills that could disable vehicles or create disruptions when needed. And Frank's been our historian, researching property records, identifying which buildings have access to the old Prohibition-era tunnels beneath downtown. Edwin nodded with approval. Delgado's knowledge of Esperanza's hidden architecture could prove invaluable for moving unseen through cartel-controlled areas. What about Thomas Jackson? How's his grandson? Stable but still hospitalized. Tom's ready to join us as soon as the boy's out of danger. Victor's expression darkened. Though after what they did to his grandson, we might need to hold him back rather than push him forward. A reasonable concern. Revenge made men reckless, and recklessness led to mistakes they couldn't afford. And Deputy Martinez? Providing what information he can without compromising his position. Sheriff Vega's keeping him on traffic duty, away from anything sensitive, but he's still our eyes inside the department. Edwin stood, wincing slightly as his hip protested. Good. Continue with surveillance rotations. I want round-the-clock observation of the Peterson barn and Mendoza's headquarters at the old Rivera Hacienda. And you? I have a dinner invitation to consider, Edwin said, holding up Mendoza's business card. Victor's eyebrows shot up. You're not seriously thinking of going? Know your enemy, Victor. Sun Tzu wrote that over 2,000 years ago, and it's still the best advice any soldier can follow. Edwin pocketed the card. Besides, I'm curious what Mendoza thinks he can offer an old man like me. Besides a shallow grave out in the desert? Edwin smiled thinly. If that were his immediate intention, he wouldn't bother with dinner first. After finalizing the next day's reconnaissance assignments, Edwin drove home as sunset painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The beauty of the landscape stood in stark contrast to the ugliness infiltrating the town. At his property, Edwin parked and performed another security check, more thorough this time given the photograph left on his truck. Nothing appeared disturbed, but the feeling of being watched prickled at the back of his neck, a sensation he hadn't experienced since patrols through bomb-out German villages in 1945. Inside, he secured his notes in the fireproof safe, then prepared a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers. As he ate at his kitchen table, Edwin's eyes were drawn to the photograph hanging on the adjacent wall, himself and Margaret on their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by friends from town. Gabriel was there, younger then, as were many faces now gone, either to death or departure as Esperanza changed. The memory of that day brought both comfort and resolve. This town had given Edwin and Margaret a home, a community, a purpose after the war. He would not surrender it without a fight. After dinner, Edwin called the number on Mendoza's business card, his decision made. A woman answered in Spanish, her voice professionally neutral. "This is Edwin Marshall," he said. "I was told to ask for Alejandro." A brief pause, Then a man's voice, the taller of the two from the park. "Senor Marshall, I am pleased you called. I'd like to accept Mr. Mendoza's dinner invitation," Edwin said. "At his convenience." "Of course. Mr. Mendoza would be honored. Tomorrow evening, perhaps? 7 o'clock at the Rivera Hacienda?" The old Rivera property, once a working ranch belonging to one of Esperanza's founding families, now served as Mendoza's local headquarters. Accepting meant walking into the heart of cartel territory. 7 o'clock would be fine, Edwin confirmed. "Should I bring anything?" A chuckle from the other end. "Only yourself, senor. A car will collect you at 6:30. Edwin ended the call and immediately placed another to Victor, using one of the disposable phones they'd acquired for secure communications. "It's set," he said when Victor answered. "Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock, the Rivera place." "You're really doing this?" Not a question, but a statement of disbelief. "Intelligence gathering, Victor. We need to understand their operations, their numbers, their defenses." Edwin's tone was matter-of-fact. "I'll be unarmed, playing the role of a curious old man considering their offer, whatever it may be." "It's too risky," Victor protested. "Let me go instead. It has to be me. I'm the former mayor, the war hero. Mendoza wants to assess me personally." Edwin's voice softened slightly. "Besides, I'm the oldest." "If something goes wrong, don't," Victor cut him off. "Age doesn't make you expendable, my friend." "No," Edwin agreed. "But experience makes me prepared. I've had dinner with the enemy before, in France after liberation. German officers who suddenly wanted to be our allies against the coming Russians." The memory brought a grim smile to his lips. "I'll wear a wire. Robert can position himself on the north ridge with a view of the hacienda. If I don't return by 9, implement contingency protocol Alpha." Victor was silent for a long moment. "The others won't like this. They don't have to like it. They just have to be ready." After ending the call, Edwin moved to his bedroom, kneeling beside the military footlocker. This time, he opened it fully, removing the carefully preserved uniform that lay on top. Beneath it was not just the M1 Garand, but a collection of items he'd hoped never to need again: a combat knife in a worn leather sheath, a compass, a small waterproof notebook with waterproof pages, a set of map reading tools. The essential kit of a combat infantry sergeant, preserved for decades. Edwin ran his fingers over the rifle's wooden stock, feeling the familiar grain of the wood. He qualified as an expert marksman in 1943, maintaining that rating throughout his service. Even now, with eyesight diminished by age, he could still outshoot men half his age at the VFW's quarterly competitions. Tomorrow he would enter the lion's den unarmed, playing a different kind of strategy. But if that strategy failed, if diplomacy and deception proved insufficient, these tools of war stood ready. And so did he. Edwin replaced the items, closed the footlocker, and prepared for bed. Sleep came surprisingly easily, the decision made bringing a certain peace. Whatever happened at the Rivera Hacienda tomorrow would set their course, either revealing a peaceful resolution, however unlikely, or confirming the necessity of the plan already taking shape among the veterans of Esperanza. As consciousness faded, Edwin's last thoughts were of Margaret, of the town as it had been, of the promise he'd made to protect what they'd built together. Some promises transcended time, age, even death itself. Some promises demanded to be kept, no matter the cost. The following evening, Edwin dressed with care: charcoal slacks, a pressed white shirt, and a navy blazer that had seen better days but still fit his lean frame well. He affixed his silver star pinned to the lapel, a calculated decision. Let Mendoza see him as the decorated veteran, a man of honor who might be appealed to on those grounds. Beneath his clothing, Edwin wore a thin wire transmitter Michael Chen had acquired through connections from his hospital work. The device was crude by modern standards but functional, a microphone taped to his chest, connected to a transmitter tucked into his lower back. Victor and George would be listening from a van parked within range, recording everything. At precisely 6:30 p.m., a black SUV pulled up to Edwin's driveway. He watched through the window as two men emerged, Alejandro from yesterday and another unfamiliar figure with the unmistakable bulge of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. Edwin took a deep breath, checking his reflection one last time in the hallway mirror. His white hair was neatly combed, his face composed into a mask of polite interest. The old combat calm had settled over him, the focused clarity that had served him well in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. He opened the door before they could knock. "Right on time," he observed, his tone pleasant but reserved. "I appreciate punctuality." Alejandro smiled. "Mr. Mendoza is eagerly awaiting your company, Senor Marshall." The drive to the Rivera Hacienda took them south of town along winding roads that climbed into the foothills. Edwin noted the changes to the once familiar landscape: new security gates, surveillance cameras mounted on fence posts, armed men positioned at key junctions. The cartel was establishing a militarized zone right under the noses of local authorities. The Rivera Hacienda itself had been transformed. Once a working cattle ranch with modest buildings, it now resembled a fortified estate. The main house had been expanded, its traditional adobe architecture preserved, but enlarged to 3 times its original size. A perimeter wall surrounded the compound, with guard towers at each corner. Edwin counted at least 8 armed men visible from the approaching road, likely twice that number unseen. "Impressive security," he commented as they passed through the main gate. "Mr. Mendoza values his privacy," Alejandro replied smoothly. "And in these uncertain times, precaution is wisdom, no?" The SUV stopped before the main house, where stone steps led to a grand entrance flanked by carved wooden doors. Edwin exited the vehicle with deliberate dignity, refusing assistance despite the twinge in his hip. A man entering negotiations showed no weakness. Inside, the hacienda reflected its owner's tastes, traditional Mexican craftsmanship blended with modern luxury. Hand-painted tiles lined the entryway, leading to a great room with vaulted ceilings and a massive stone fireplace. The furnishings were expensive but understated, the art on the walls authentic and valuable. Alejandro led Edwin through the house to a terrace overlooking the valley below. The sun was setting, painting the landscape in gold and shadow. From this elevation, all of Esperanza was visible, a small collection of lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. A man stood at the terrace's edge, his back to them, hands clasped behind him as he surveyed his domain. He turned at their approach, revealing a face Edwin knew only from photographs and local rumors: Luis Mendoza, leader of the Los Alacranes cartel in this region. Mendoza was younger than Edwin had expected, perhaps 50, with salt and pepper hair cut short in an expensive style. His face bore the lean, weathered quality of a man who had worked outdoors in his youth, with sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes. He wore a simple white guayabera shirt and dark trousers, no visible jewelry except for a gold watch that probably cost more than Edwin's house. "Sergeant Edwin Marshall," Mendoza said, his English perfect but accented. "It is a genuine honor. Thank you for accepting my invitation." He extended his hand. Edwin took it, noting the firm grip, the calluses that suggested this cartel leader hadn't always directed operations from behind a desk. "Mr. Mendoza, thank you for your hospitality." Mendoza gestured to a table set for dinner, complete with fine china, crystal glasses, and silver candlesticks. "Please sit. We have much to discuss, and good conversation is best accompanied by good food." A server appeared silently, pouring wine into Mendoza's glass and looking questioningly at Edwin. "Water for me, thank you," Edwin said. "Medication?" Mendoza nodded with understanding. "Of course. Age brings wisdom, but also its inconveniences, no?" The meal began with a soup, sopa de lima, fragrant with citrus and chilies. As they ate, Mendoza kept the conversation light, discussing the weather, the local landscape, neutral topics that established a foundation of civility. "I understand you were mayor of Esperanza for some time," Mendoza said as the soup plates were cleared. Edwin nodded. 3 terms, from 1978 to 1990. And before that, a war hero. Silver Star in the European theater. Mendoza gestured toward the pin on Edwin's lapel. May I ask what action earned you such distinction? A test, perhaps, to verify Edwin's credentials or to assess his character through the telling. Hurtgen Forest, November 1944. Edwin replied evenly. My platoon was pinned down by machine gun fire. I led a flanking maneuver through difficult terrain to eliminate the emplacement. We took 16 casualties but completed our objective. Edwin delivered the summary without embellishment, the way soldiers spoke of such things among themselves. The citation had used words like valor and courage under fire, but those who had been there knew it was simply necessity, what had to be done in the moment. Mendoza studied him with new interest. You speak of it clinically, like a professional. That's what I was, Mr. Mendoza. A professional soldier doing his job. And now? What is Edwin Marshall's profession these days? I'm retired, Edwin said, accepting a plate of chili rellenos from the server. I tend my property. I observe the changing seasons. I remember the past. And the present? Do you observe that as well? Mendoza's tone remained conversational, but his eyes had sharpened. I'm told you keep detailed notes on our town's activities. Edwin met his gaze steadily. Old habits. A soldier learns to record what he sees. Indeed. Mendoza took a sip of wine. And what do those old soldiers' eyes see in Esperanza these days? The moment had arrived, the purpose of this dinner, the reason for Mendoza's interest in an 88-year-old veteran. Edwin chose his words with care. I see change, Mr. Mendoza. Some call it progress, others decline. I see new faces, new businesses, new methods of operation. He set down his fork. I see fear where there was once community. I see intimidation where there was once cooperation. Instead of taking offense, Mendoza nodded thoughtfully. Direct. I appreciate that. He leaned forward slightly. Change is inevitable, Sergeant Marshall. Borders are human constructs that money, power, and necessity ignore. Your government draws lines on maps and declares them sacred, then abandons the people living along those lines to fend for themselves. Is that what you're doing? Helping people fend for themselves? A smile touched Mendoza's lips. I provide opportunity, employment, structure, protection. Protection from threats you create, Edwin observed. A simplistic view. Mendoza made a dismissive gesture. The world changed while America wasn't looking, Sergeant. Your country fought wars across oceans while leaving its own backyard vulnerable. Nature abhors a vacuum. We merely filled the space you left empty. The main course arrived, a perfectly cooked carne asada with grilled vegetables. Edwin took a bite, acknowledging the quality of the food with a nod, but refusing to be distracted from the conversation's purpose. Why am I here, Mr. Mendoza? I doubt you invited me simply to debate political philosophy. Mendoza laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Direct indeed. Very well. He set down his utensils and focused his full attention on Edwin. You are here because you are a man of influence in Esperanza. Not official influence, perhaps, not anymore. But moral influence. Historical influence. The kind that cannot be bought or intimidated. And that concerns you? It interests me, Mendoza corrected. Men like you. Men who have seen real war, real death. Understand certain realities that civilians do not. You understand that power, once established, cannot simply be wished away. That accommodation is sometimes wiser than resistance. Edwin maintained a neutral expression. That sounds like a roundabout way of asking me not to interfere with your operations. Not asking, Sergeant. Offering. Mendoza leaned back in his chair. Your military service, your terms as mayor, these show a lifetime of dedication to ideals. Duty, community, protection of the innocent. Admirable qualities. Thank you, Edwin said, wondering where this flattery led. But ideals require resources to implement. Your government has abandoned this region, left communities like Esperanza to wither. I have resources. I have personnel. I have vision. And what vision is that exactly? Mendoza spread his hands, encompassing the view of the town below. A prosperous community. Secure. Employed. a model of what the borderlands could become when freed from the artificial constraints of failed policy. With you as its benefactor. Edwin didn't phrase it as a question. With me as its partner. Mendoza's expression grew earnest. The people of Esperanza need protection from poverty, from neglect, from the chaos of a world changing too quickly. My organization can provide that protection. In exchange for what? Cooperation. Discretion. A percentage of local business revenue that is far less than they would pay in taxes to a government that gives them nothing in return. Edwin took a sip of water, using the moment to formulate his response. And those who refuse your partnership? Mendoza's face hardened slightly. The well-being of the community sometimes requires sacrifice from individuals. Those who cannot see the larger picture may need convincing. Like John Powell? Or Thomas Jackson's grandson? A flash of annoyance crossed Mendoza's features before he controlled it. Unfortunate incidents. Overzealous employees acting beyond their instructions. I do not condone unnecessary violence. But you employ men who practice it, Edwin pointed out. I employ men with particular skills, as all organizations do. As your military did. As your government still does. Mendoza refilled his wine glass. We are not so different, you and I. Both seeking order in our respective domains, both willing to use necessary force to maintain it. Edwin felt a chill at the comparison, but kept his expression unchanged. If we're so similar, what do you want from me? Your blessing, Mendoza said simply. Your public acceptance of the new reality in Esperanza. Your influence with the other veterans, with the church, with the old families who still resist change. And if I provide this blessing, you would be generously compensated, of course. A consulting fee, let's call it. $5,000 monthly. Your property tax is waived. Medical care provided by the finest doctors in El Paso. Mendoza leaned forward. And more importantly, your legacy protected. The town you helped build, preserved rather than destroyed in pointless resistance. The offer hung in the air between them. Edwin allowed the silence to stretch, as if considering the proposal seriously. An interesting proposition, he said finally. One that requires careful thought. Mendoza nodded, seemingly pleased. Of course. A man like you doesn't make decisions hastily. He raised his wine glass. To consideration of new possibilities. Edwin raised his water glass in return. To clear-eyed assessment of all options. As they finished the meal, the conversation turned to lighter topics, the history of the region, shared observations about human nature, even a brief discussion of military tactics that revealed Mendoza had some formal training himself. Throughout, Edwin maintained his role, the old soldier weighing an unexpected proposition, neither accepting nor rejecting outright. After dinner, Mendoza suggested a tour of the property. They walked the grounds as security personnel maintained a respectful distance but remained vigilant. Edwin noted everything with a soldier's eye: guard rotations, weapons carried, communication equipment, vulnerabilities in the perimeter. You've created quite an operation here, Edwin observed as they returned to the main house. Impressive logistics. Mendoza acknowledged the compliment with a slight bow. Organization is the foundation of success in any enterprise. I suspect your military career taught you the same principle. At the front entrance, Mendoza extended his hand once more. I've enjoyed our conversation, Sergeant Marshall. I believe we understand each other better now. Edwin shook the offered hand. Indeed. It's been illuminating. Take 3 days to consider my offer. Alejandro will contact you for your answer. Mendoza's grip tightened slightly. I sincerely hope you choose partnership over opposition. I would regret any unpleasantness between us. As would I, Edwin replied, his tone neutral. Thank you for your hospitality. The same SUV carried him home, Alejandro riding alongside in silence. As they approached Edwin's property, Edwin noticed something that made his pulse quicken, a column of smoke rising from the direction of his house. Alejandro's phone buzzed with a text message. After reading it, he looked at Edwin with an expression of manufactured concern. It seems there has been an unfortunate incident at your home, Senor Marshall. A fire. How distressing. The SUV accelerated. bringing them to Edwin's driveway in minutes. His workshop, a small outbuilding where he kept tools and personal projects, was engulfed in flames. The main house appeared untouched, but the message was unmistakable. "How terrible," Alejandro said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Perhaps faulty wiring? These old buildings can be so dangerous." Edwin turned to him, dropping all pretense of consideration. "We both know what this is, Alejandro." A crude attempt at persuasion. The man's expression hardened. "Consider it a reminder of the seriousness of Mr. Mendoza's offer and the consequences of rejection." "I understand perfectly," Edwin replied, his voice steady despite the fury building within him. "Please convey to Mr. Mendoza that I'll have my answer in 3 days, as requested." Alejandro nodded, and the SUV departed, leaving Edwin standing before his burning workshop. The structure was already beyond saving. He made no move to call the fire department. They wouldn't arrive in time, and the blaze was contained enough not to threaten the house or nearby trees. Instead, he retrieved his phone and made a single call. "I'm back," he said when Victor answered. Meeting concluded. "Did you receive the transmission?" "Every word," Victor confirmed. "Are you all right?" "We just got reports of a fire at your property." "My workshop. A parting gift from our hosts. Contained, not threatening the house." Edwin watched the flames with cold calculation rather than despair. "Meet me at the secondary location. 1 hour. Bring everyone." Edwin ended the call and entered his house. He moved with purpose now, all thoughts of accommodation or negotiation burned away like his workshop. He changed quickly into practical clothing, dark pants, a navy shirt, sturdy boots. From the fireproof safe, he retrieved his notes and documents, adding the intelligence gathered during the evening's dinner. From the military footlocker, he removed the M1 Garand rifle, the combat knife, and his old combat webbing. He hadn't worn the latter since 1945, but muscle memory took over as he adjusted the straps to his now thinner frame. Before departing, Edwin stood before Margaret's photograph. "I tried diplomacy, Maggie," he said quietly. "They responded with fire. What follows is on their heads, not mine." An hour later, Edwin sat at a table in the back room of George Blackhawk's pawn shop, a location chosen for its security and central position. Around him gathered the veterans of Esperanza, their faces grim in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Victor had already briefed them on the dinner conversation and its fiery conclusion. Now they looked to Edwin for direction, the habits of military hierarchy reasserting themselves in this crisis. "Gentlemen," Edwin began, "tonight has confirmed what we suspected. Mendoza has no intention of leaving Esperanza. His talk of partnership is merely conquest by another name. His offer to me was a transparent attempt to neutralize potential resistance." Robert Williams, the former Marine sniper, leaned forward. "And the fire?" "A demonstration of what happens to those who resist." Edwin's voice remained steady. "A miscalculation on their part. They believe intimidation will force compliance." "What's your assessment of their capabilities?" George asked, the intelligence specialist focusing on practical matters. Edwin spread out a hand-drawn map of the compound, created from memory immediately after his return. Approximately 20 armed personnel visible at the hacienda. Military-grade weapons, primarily AR-15 variants. Communication via radio and smartphone. Guard rotation suggests another 20 off-duty or deployed elsewhere. Surveillance equipment at all access points. The veterans absorbed this information with professional detachment, mentally calculating odds and strategies. "Their weak point is overconfidence," Edwin continued. "Mendoza doesn't view us as a serious threat. He sees old men, past their prime, easily neutralized through intimidation or bribery." Michaelchen, the former combat medic, nodded thoughtfully. "Their first mistake. And a crucial one," Edwin agreed. "They've revealed their hand while underestimating ours. Now we must decide how to respond." William Foster, the Navy veteran and electrician, spoke up. "What about the authorities? With your recording, we have evidence of criminal conspiracy, extortion, arson." Edwin shook his head. "Sheriff Vega is compromised. State police would take days to respond, if they respond at all. Federal agencies are overwhelmed with larger cartel operations. By the time official help arrived, if it ever did, Mendoza would have destroyed the evidence and possibly us along with it. So we're on our own, Frank Delgado said. At 91, the Pacific Theater veteran was their eldest member, but his mind remained sharp. As this town has always been, Edwin confirmed. We have three options. First, we can comply, accept Mendoza's new order, and hope to mitigate the worst of it through cooperation. Second, we can flee, abandon Esperanza to its fate, and live out our days elsewhere. Or third, we fight, Victor finished. Edwin nodded, looking each man in the eye. We're old, gentlemen. Our fighting days should be behind us. No one would blame us for choosing either of the first two options. But before you decide, consider what we know. He laid out photographs taken by their surveillance teams over recent weeks. Young men being recruited into cartel operations, drugs being moved through local businesses, weapons stockpiled in what had once been a community storage facility. This is not just about control or money, Edwin continued. Mendoza is establishing a forward operating base for expanded cartel activities, using Esperanza as a staging area for distribution throughout the region. If we don't stop it here, the cancer spreads. The veterans exchanged glances, decades of combat experience informing their assessment. They understood the stakes, the risks, the unlikely odds of success. I have grandchildren in Austin, Frank said after a long moment. I could go there. Should go there, probably. Live out my days in peace. He straightened in his chair, old spine stiffening with resolve. But I won't. This town gave me a home when I came back from the Pacific with nightmares that wouldn't quit. It's mine to defend. One by one, the others voiced similar sentiments. No one chose compliance. No one chose flight. Then we're agreed, Edwin said, feeling both weight and clarity descend upon him. We fight, not as vigilantes seeking revenge, but as defenders protecting what is ours. We fight smart. We fight strategically. We fight to win. The planning session that followed lasted until dawn. Each veteran contributed expertise from their military specialization. Robert outlined sniper positions to control key terrain. George established communications protocols using encrypted channels. Michael inventoried medical supplies and created casualty response plans. William designed improvised devices to disable cartel vehicles and communications. Frank mapped the old tunnels beneath downtown that could provide concealed movement. As sunrise approached, Edwin rolled out a detailed topographical map of Esperanza and the surrounding area. Mendoza thinks he holds the high ground at the Rivera Hacienda, Edwin said. Tactically, perhaps. But we hold something more valuable, knowledge of the terrain, the people, the history of this place. It's our home. We've lived here for decades. That's an advantage no amount of firepower can overcome. The veterans gathered around the map as Edwin outlined their strategy, not a frontal assault, which would be suicide against superior numbers and weaponry, but a campaign of targeted disruption. Phase 1, Intelligence Confirmation. He began, marking locations on the map. We verify cartel positions, strength, routines. Phase 2, Resource Denial. We interrupt their supply lines, communications, revenue streams. Phase 3, Isolation. We cut them off from reinforcement and retreat routes. And only then, Phase 4, Direct Engagement, on our terms, at locations of our choosing. It was a strategy born of necessity. Old men who couldn't match the cartel in physical strength or numbers, but who could leverage experience, planning, and the home field advantage. Time frame, Victor asked. 1 week for phases 1 and 2. Mendoza gave me 3 days to respond to his offer. When I don't, they'll increase pressure, probably target another veteran's property. We'll use their focus on us to gather final intelligence and begin disruption operations. Edwin straightened, feeling the weight of command settle onto shoulders that had carried it before, long ago. This is not a war we sought, but it's one we're equipped to fight. We've all faced worse odds in service to our country. Now we serve our home. The veterans nodded, a solemn covenant formed among men who understood the gravity of what they were undertaking. There would be no medals this time, no parades if they succeeded, only the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. As the others departed to begin their assigned tasks, Edwin remained at the table, studying the map. Victor stayed behind, concern evident in his eyes. "You're thinking of Normandy," Victor said, not a question but a statement of understanding. Edwin nodded. "Different enemy. Same principles. We were younger then. Stronger, but not smarter." Edwin traced a finger along the route from the Rivera Hacienda to town. "We have something they don't, Victor. Something no training can provide." "What's that?" "Nothing left to lose." Edwin looked up, his blue eyes clear and determined. "When a man my age faces evil, the calculation is simple. Whatever time I have left is better spent in one final worthy fight than in years of shameful peace." Victor clasped his shoulder. "Get some rest, my friend. Tomorrow, we begin." The next morning, Edwin awoke before dawn, his body stiff but his mind clear. The smell of smoke still lingered from his destroyed workshop. He performed his morning routine with military precision, then sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and the burner phone they'd established for secure communications. One by one, he called each veteran, confirming their readiness to implement Phase 1. By noon, their surveillance network was operational, Robert and William positioned with observation equipment at strategic locations, George monitoring communications, the others preparing equipment and supplies for the phases to follow. Edwin's assigned role was coordination and planning, a concession to his age and the hip that increasingly limited his mobility. But there was one task he reserved for himself, a personal reconnaissance of the Peterson barn that Mendoza had converted to a distribution center. Under the guise of a countryside drive, Edwin approached the property from the north, using an old ranch road that wound through hills thick with mesquite and scrub oak. He parked his truck behind a ridge line and continued on foot, moving slowly but deliberately through terrain he'd known since childhood. The pain in his hip was constant now, each step requiring conscious effort, but Edwin pushed it aside through the mental discipline learned in basic training and refined through combat. Pain was information, nothing more. It could be acknowledged and then ignored in service to the mission. From a concealed position on the hillside, Edwin observed the Peterson barn through binoculars. What had once been a simple agricultural structure had been transformed. Reinforced doors, new metal roof, generators providing power, security cameras mounted at all approaches. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter while others loaded crates into an unmarked box truck. Edwin documented everything: personnel numbers, weapons carried, vehicle details, timing of operations. He noted vulnerabilities. The generators were exposed, the security camera blind spots, the predictable patrol routes of the guards who clearly didn't expect observation from this direction. As he watched, a black SUV arrived, the same model that had taken him to dinner the previous night. Alejandro emerged, speaking animatedly with the men loading the truck. Even from this distance, Edwin could read the body language: frustration, urgency, heightened alertness. His absence of response to Mendoza's offer was already creating pressure. Good. An enemy responding to pressure made mistakes. Edwin was about to retreat when movement in his peripheral vision froze him in place. A patrol, 2 armed men he hadn't accounted for, moving along the ridge less than 100 yards from his position. Edwin lowered himself slowly to the ground, using the natural depression and sparse vegetation for concealment. At 88, even with a lifetime of training, he couldn't outrun or overpower these men. His only option was to remain motionless and hope they passed without noticing him. The patrol moved closer, speaking Spanish in low voices. Edwin controlled his breathing, kept his eyes half-lidded to prevent the whites from catching the sunlight. Techniques taught to him by a Native American scout attached to his unit in France, who'd learned them from his grandfather. One of the men paused, scuffing the dirt with his boot less than 20 feet from Edwin's position. He scanned the hillside, eyes passing over Edwin's concealed form, then moving on. A radio crackled at his belt. He answered in Spanish, received instructions, and gestured to his partner. They turned and headed back toward the barn. Edwin remained motionless for 10 more minutes, ensuring they were truly gone before carefully extracting himself from his hiding place. His joints protested as he stood, back and hips screaming from the prolonged immobility in an awkward position. He ignored the pain and began his slow retreat to the truck. By the time Edwin returned to town, afternoon was fading into evening. He drove to Victor's garage, where the veterans had gathered to compile their day's intelligence. The back room had been transformed into an operations center, maps covering the walls, communications equipment on tables, weapons and supplies organized on shelves. "You took an unnecessary risk," Victor said by way of greeting, his tone matching the concern in his eyes. "Necessary reconnaissance," Edwin corrected, spreading out his notes on the central table. "The Peterson operation is larger than we thought. Approximately 10 personnel on site. Distribution activities accelerating. They're moving product out tonight." George joined them, adding his own intelligence. "Cartel communications traffic has increased 30% since yesterday. They're looking for you, my friend." Mendoza expected an answer by now. "Let him wait," Edwin replied. "Uncertainty creates opportunity." As the other veterans reported their findings, a comprehensive picture emerged. Cartel operations concentrated in 5 locations around Esperanza, with the Rivera Hacienda as command and control, the Peterson barn as the main distribution center, and 3 smaller outposts in town providing security and local enforcement. Total estimated personnel, 40 to 50 armed men, primarily concentrated at the hacienda and barn, with smaller teams rotating through town. Weapons observed included primarily semi-automatic rifles, handguns, and at least 2 heavy machine guns mounted on vehicles. Overwhelming force in a direct confrontation, Robert assessed, the sniper's calculations precise, but spread thin if engaged at multiple points simultaneously. Edwin nodded. "Exactly. They've established dominance through fear rather than numbers. They don't expect coordinated resistance." The veterans gathered around the map as Edwin outlined the next phase of their strategy. "Tomorrow we begin resource denial operations. Small, seemingly unrelated incidents that disrupt their activities without revealing our full intentions." He assigned specific tasks to each team. Victor and Michael would disable the generator at the Peterson barn through a staged electrical malfunction. Robert would eliminate security cameras at strategic locations with precision rifle fire, appearing to be random vandalism. George would introduce interference to their radio communications through equipment William had modified. Frank would coordinate with Deputy Martinez to ensure law enforcement was conveniently absent from target areas. "And what about Mendoza's deadline?" William asked. "It expires tonight." Edwin's expression remained calm. "I'll handle that personally." Later that evening, as darkness settled over Esperanza, Edwin sat on his porch, the Remington shotgun across his knees. He'd made no effort to conceal his presence or his weaponry, quite the opposite. A single lamp illuminated him clearly, making him visible from the road. At precisely 9 p.m., headlights appeared, moving slowly toward his property. The black SUV stopped at his gate. Edwin remained seated, shotgun in plain view, but pointed safely downward. Alejandro emerged from the vehicle, another armed man beside him. They approached the gate but didn't open it. "Senor Marshall," Alejandro called. "Mr. Mendoza awaits your answer." Edwin's voice carried clearly through the still night air. "My workshop provided the answer, I believe." Fire tends to clarify one's thinking. Alejandro's expression hardened. "You reject Mr. Mendoza's generous offer?" "I reject threats disguised as offers," Edwin replied. "I reject intimidation masquerading as partnership. I reject your presence in my town." "You speak as if you have authority here," Alejandro said, a dangerous edge entering his voice. "You do not. Your authority ended years ago, old man. The town has new leadership now." "Leadership is earned, not seized," Edwin countered. "Esperanza doesn't bend to bullies. Never has. Never will." Alejandro's hand moved toward his weapon. Bold words for a man alone against many. Who says I'm alone? Edwin's calm confidence gave the cartel lieutenant pause. Deliver this message to Mendoza. Esperanza is not for sale or seizure. Those who threaten it will face consequences. You threaten us? Disbelief and anger colored Alejandro's voice. You are nothing. An old relic, a forgotten soldier playing at war games. Edwin smiled thinly. Wars are won by those who understand the battlefield, Alejandro. You're on our ground now. He stood, shotgun held respectfully but visibly, and turned to enter his house. This isn't over, viejo. Alejandro called after him. Edwin paused at his door. On that much, we agree. It's just beginning. He closed the door behind him, locking it methodically. Through the window, he watched the SUV depart, its tires throwing gravel in anger. The first move in their new game had been played. Mendoza would be forced to respond, to allocate resources to this unexpected resistance. And when he did, the veterans of Esperanza would be waiting. That night, for the first time since Margaret's passing, Edwin removed his service pistol from its locked case, a Colt M1911A1 that had accompanied him across Europe. He cleaned it with practiced hands, the ritual as familiar as his own heartbeat. Then he loaded it, chambered a round, and placed it on his bedside table within easy reach. The opening moves had been made. The battle for Esperanza had begun. Edwin Marshall, who had once helped liberate towns across France from another occupying force, prepared to do the same for his home. Sometimes, history rhymed in the strangest ways. The next 72 hours transformed Esperanza in ways its residents could barely comprehend. A series of seemingly unrelated incidents disrupted the cartel's operations throughout the region. Mechanical failures, electrical outages, communication breakdowns, and security breaches that individually might be dismissed as coincidence but collectively represented a coordinated campaign. At the Peterson barn, the generator failed catastrophically during a major shipment preparation, plunging the operation into darkness at a critical moment. Thousands of dollars worth of product was dropped, packages broke open, and contamination rendered much of it worthless. In town, security cameras outside cartel-controlled businesses mysteriously malfunctioned. Their lenses shattered by what appeared to be rocks thrown by vandals, but were actually precision shots from Robert's .22 rifle fired from concealed positions over 400 yards away. Cartel communications suffered inexplicable interference, with radios picking up fragments of police bands, trucker channels, and sometimes bizarre loops of music that rendered coordination between units nearly impossible. The source of the disruption remained untraceable despite increasingly frantic efforts by Mendoza's technical team. Vehicles used for transportation and enforcement developed strange mechanical issues. Tires that gradually deflated due to nearly invisible punctures, fuel systems contaminated with substances that caused engines to sputter and die at unpredictable intervals, ignition systems that worked intermittently or not at all. Most frustrating for the cartel leadership were the raids by local law enforcement that somehow always occurred just after product had been moved into a location but before distribution could begin. Deputy Martinez, working with Frank Delgado's intelligence, ensured that just enough legitimate police action occurred to add to the cartel's growing paranoia without exposing their inside source. On the fourth morning, Edwin sat with Victor and George in the back room of the pawn shop, reviewing reports of the previous night's activities. The map on the wall now featured new annotations, red X's marking successful disruption operations, blue circles indicating cartel responses, green checks identifying confirmed intelligence on personnel movements. Phase 2 is proceeding better than anticipated, George observed, his intelligence analysts mind cataloging patterns in the data. Their communications are increasingly desperate. Mendoza has called in additional personnel from El Paso and Juarez. How many? Edwin asked, making notes in his precise handwriting. At least 15 arrived last night. More expected today. They're fortifying the hacienda and doubling patrols in town. Victor looked concerned. Escalation brings risk. More cartel members means more eyes, more weapons, more potential for civilian casualties. Edwin nodded, acknowledging the concern while continuing to analyze the situation. It also means stretched supply lines, unfamiliar personnel operating in unknown territory, and increased internal friction. Mendoza is responding exactly as predicted, treating this as a show of force problem rather than a strategic intelligence failure. The burner phone on the table buzzed. Edwin answered, listened briefly, then hung up. Robert reports 6 vehicle convoys moving from the hacienda to town. Armed personnel visible in each. They're establishing a more visible presence. Victor checked his watch. Right on schedule. They want to be seen now, to reassert control through intimidation. Which gives us our next opportunity, Edwin said, pointing to the map. They're concentrating forces in the business district, leaving the hacienda and distribution points relatively undermanned. George smiled grimly. Phase 3. Phase 3, Edwin confirmed. Isolation begins tonight. The veterans dispersed to their assigned preparations. By nightfall, each team was in position for the most ambitious operations yet. Not just disruption, but active interdiction of cartel movements. Edwin, despite objections from the others, insisted on taking a direct role in this phase. He positioned himself in the bell tower of St. Mary's Church, which offered an elevated observation post overlooking the town center. Father Gabriel had provided access without questions, his only comment a quiet prayer for their safety. From this vantage point, Edwin could coordinate the veterans' movements using the secure radio network George had established. His M1911 pistol was holstered at his side, the Garand rifle leaning against the wall beside him. Weapons he hoped wouldn't be necessary, but had brought nonetheless. As darkness settled over Esperanza, the cartel's increased presence became evident. SUVs patrolling the streets, armed men stationed outside businesses, intimidating displays of weapons and numbers meant to cow the populace back into submission. Eagle in position, Edwin spoke softly into his radio, using their agreed-upon call signs. Status report. One by one, the veterans acknowledged their readiness. Victor and Michael at the northern roadblock. Robert covering the eastern approach from his sniper hide. William and Frank preparing the southern diversion. George monitoring cartel communications from his mobile setup in a concealed van. Execute Phase 3, Edwin ordered. Maintain discipline. Non-lethal measures only unless directly threatened. The operation began with William's electrical expertise. Street lights along Main Street suddenly extinguished, plunging the town center into darkness. Simultaneously, Frank activated the fire alarm at the abandoned textile factory on the south edge of town, creating a distraction that drew cartel resources away from the business district. In the confusion, Victor and Michael implemented the roadblocks, not obvious barricades that would immediately alert the cartel, but subtle obstructions. Delivery trucks that mysteriously broke down at key intersections. Construction equipment that had been mistakenly left blocking side streets. Concrete culverts that rolled into roadways, apparently dislodged by the strong winds that had picked up as evening fell. Within 30 minutes, Esperanza had been effectively divided into isolated sectors, with cartel forces unable to move quickly between locations. Their communications, already degraded by the veterans' earlier efforts, deteriorated further as George activated a more powerful jamming system that blocked their primary frequencies entirely. From his observation post, Edwin watched the cartel's response unfold. Initial confusion gave way to increasing frustration as commanders attempted to coordinate without reliable communications. Vehicles were dispatched to clear obstacles, only to encounter additional problems: flat tires, overheated engines, electrical failures that Victor had arranged through careful sabotage earlier in the day. They're adapting, Edwin noted as he observed a group of cartel members abandoning a stalled SUV and proceeding on foot. Central group moving east on Cottonwood, armed, approximately 6 individuals. Copy, Robert's voice replied through the radio. I have visual, marking their position. Robert's marking came in the form of a .22 round that shattered the pavement at the feet of the lead cartel member, a warning shot precise enough to communicate threat but unlikely to cause injury. The group scattered for cover, their coordination dissolving in the face of an unseen threat. Similar scenes played out across Esperanza as the veterans implemented their carefully orchestrated plan. Not direct engagement. They were too few and too old for that. But strategic disruption, creating an environment of uncertainty that negated the cartel's advantages in numbers and firepower. 2 hours into the operation, Edwin's radio crackled with George's voice. Intercepted communication from the hacienda. Mendoza is mobilizing all available personnel to re-establish control in town. Approximately 20 armed individuals deploying in multiple vehicles. As expected, Edwin replied. Trigger the next phase. The next phase involved the most audacious element of their plan, the temporary isolation of the Rivera hacienda itself. As Mendoza dispatched reinforcements to town, William activated his most sophisticated creation, a series of remotely triggered devices placed along the only road connecting the hacienda to Esperanza. Not explosives. The veterans had drawn a firm line against anything that might cause indiscriminate harm, but precisely engineered impediments. Fallen trees that appeared to have been weakened by recent rains. A strategic ditch collapse that made the road impassable to vehicles. Motion-activated strobe lights that would temporarily blind drivers attempting to navigate around obstacles. The result was immediate. The reinforcements dispatched from the hacienda found themselves trapped between obstacles, unable to proceed forward or retreat easily. Cartel communications, monitored by George, reflected growing panic as Mendoza realized his command center was now effectively cut off from his forces in town. Divide and conquer, Edwin murmured to himself, memories of military campaigns from another lifetime surfacing in his mind. Just as the operation appeared to be proceeding perfectly, an unexpected complication arose. Edwin observed 3 cartel vehicles converging on Powell's general store, where the owner had remained against advice, refusing to abandon his family business. Potential civilian situation at Powell's, Edwin alerted the team. I count 9 cartel personnel, heavily armed, approaching from multiple directions. Victor's voice came through the radio. We're too far north to intervene quickly. I'm moving, Edwin decided, gathering his equipment. Robert, can you establish overwatch on that position? Affirmative. I have line of sight, but limited firing angles due to civilian presence. Edwin descended from the bell tower as quickly as his aging body allowed. The pain in his hip a distant concern against the immediate danger to John Powell. He exited the church through a side door, keeping to shadows as he made his way toward the general store 4 blocks away. The night had grown darker as clouds moved in, promising rain. The wind had strengthened, adding to the confusion as it carried sounds in deceptive directions. Edwin used these conditions to his advantage, moving from cover to cover with the stealth that had once earned him commendations in Europe. He reached the alley behind Powell's store just as the confrontation began. Through the back window, he could see John Powell standing defiantly behind his counter, facing 3 cartel members who had entered through the front. Their postures were aggressive, weapons visible but not yet raised. The others remained outside, establishing a perimeter. Edwin assessed the situation with cold clarity. Direct intervention would likely escalate to lethal violence. Powell's immediate compliance and extraction was the priority. He tapped lightly on the back door, a signal they had established days earlier when Edwin had warned the stubborn shopkeeper that such a moment might come. Powell glanced toward the sound but gave no indication to his unwanted visitors. One of the cartel members was speaking, his voice rising in anger. Edwin couldn't make out the words, but the meaning was clear from his gestures, demands, threats, ultimatums. Powell stood his ground, a testament to either courage or foolishness. Edwin removed a small device from his pocket, another of William's creations, designed for distraction rather than destruction. He activated it and slid it beneath a parked car near the cartel members standing guard outside the front of the store. 30 seconds later, the device emitted a series of loud pops and flashes, a convincing simulation of gunfire that sent the cartel members diving for cover. Inside, the three confronting Powell turned toward the commotion, momentarily distracted. In that instant, Powell moved with surprising speed for a man in his 50s, ducking through the curtain behind the counter and racing for the back door. Edwin had it open and was pulling Powell through before the cartel members realized their quarry had escaped. "Stay low, move fast," Edwin instructed as they fled down the alley. "Robert has Overwatch." True to Edwin's words, when one of the cartel members appeared at the store's back door, weapon raised, a .22 round struck the doorframe inches from his head. The man immediately retreated inside, unwilling to pursue into what appeared to be an ambush. Edwin led Powell through a pre-planned escape route, using the old service alleys that connected Esperanza's original downtown buildings. Despite his age and infirmity, Edwin moved with purpose, decades of training overriding physical limitations. They reached Victor's garage 15 minutes later, where Powell was quickly ushered into a concealed room where other civilians at particular risk, including Thomas Jackson's recovered grandson, had been sheltered. "They came for a final warning," Powell explained, still catching his breath. "Said the disruptions in town were my last chance to sell the store to their approved buyer before consequences became permanent." Edwin nodded grimly. "They're trying to consolidate control of the business district while dealing with our operations. Two fronts stretching their resources." He returned to St. Mary's Church, resuming his observation post as the operation continued through the night. The veterans maintained pressure on cartel positions throughout Esperanza, never engaging directly, but creating an environment of constant disruption and uncertainty. By dawn, the cartel's normally efficient operations were in disarray. Vehicles remained stranded at various points around town. Communication between units was fragmented and unreliable. Personnel were exhausted from a night of high alert with no clear enemy to engage. Edwin gathered the veterans at their fallback position, an abandoned ranger station in the hills overlooking town, which Robert had prepared as a secondary command post. "Phase 3 has achieved its objectives," Edwin assessed, his voice gravelly from a night without sleep. "The cartel's forces are divided, their mobility restricted, their communications compromised." Victor, looking similarly exhausted but determined, studied the updated map. "Mendoza will adapt, probably already requesting additional resources from across the border." "Precisely why we moved to Phase 4 immediately," Edwin replied. "We've created a window of opportunity while they're disorganized. We need to exploit it before reinforcements arrive." Phase 4, direct engagement, had always been the most dangerous aspect of their plan. Not open combat, which would be suicide against cartel firepower, but targeted strikes against key leadership and infrastructure. "Primary target?" George asked. Edwin pointed to the map. "The Peterson barn. Intelligence indicates it contains their primary product storage, documentation of distribution networks, and possibly financial records. We capture those, we gain leverage." The veterans reviewed the assault plan Edwin had developed, a coordinated approach using the confusion they'd created to enable a small team to infiltrate the facility during shift change, when security would be at its most vulnerable. As they finalized preparations, Deputy Martinez arrived with urgent news. "Mendoza's called a meeting at the town hall," he reported. "Mandatory attendance for all business owners and community leaders. 2 hours from now." Edwin frowned. This was an unexpected development. Purpose: public reassertion of control. He's bringing in someone high up from the cartel hierarchy across the border, seeking to demonstrate that these disruptions aren't weakening their grip. Martinez hesitated. "There's more. They've taken hostages to ensure attendance. Father Gabriel and Dr. Wilson from the clinic." A cold silence fell over the room. The veterans had anticipated cartel escalation, but not civilian hostages. The situation had evolved beyond their carefully constructed parameters. Edwin's mind worked through the new variables, experience from countless combat situations, providing clarity where others might find only chaos. "This changes our approach, but not our objective," he said finally. Mendoza is making a critical error, concentrating his leadership and focusing his attention on a public display rather than securing his operations. Edwin modified the plan, reassigning roles to address the dual targets. The Peterson Barn operation would proceed with Robert, William, and Frank, while Edwin, Victor, George, and Michael would deal with the town hall situation. "This is the moment that will define everything that follows," Edwin told his fellow veterans. "Today, Esperanza either begins its liberation or falls completely under cartel control." The veterans prepared with solemn efficiency, checking weapons and equipment. For the first time, they armed themselves more substantially, not just for defense, but with the expectation of potential combat. The weight of weapons once carried across foreign battlefields now returned to hands that had hoped never to bear them again in anger. As the others made final preparations, Victor drew Edwin aside. "This is escalating beyond what we anticipated," he said quietly. "The likelihood of casualties, theirs and possibly ours, has increased significantly." Edwin nodded, acknowledging the concern without flinching from it. "War is always unpredictable, Victor. We adapt or we fail. Is that what this is now?" "War. It became war the moment they took hostages," Edwin replied. "They've crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." 2 hours later, Edwin sat in his truck a block from the town hall, observing the situation through binoculars. Cartel members had established checkpoints at all approaches to the building, searching everyone who entered. Inside, visible through the large front windows, dozens of townspeople had gathered, fear evident even at this distance. On the roof, 2 armed men maintained overwatch positions. At the main entrance, for more controlled access, Edwin estimated at least 20 cartel members in and around the building, a significant portion of Mendoza's remaining force. "Status at the Peterson Barn?" Edwin asked into his radio. "In position," Robert reported. "Security lighter than expected. Most personnel appear to have been redirected to town. Proceed as planned. Maintain radio discipline from this point forward." Edwin turned to his team, gathered in vehicles positioned strategically around the town hall. "Remember, our primary objective is hostage extraction and civilian protection. Neutralize threats with minimal force necessary. These are our neighbors in there." At precisely 2 p.m., as Mendoza would be beginning his demonstration of control, the veterans initiated their most audacious operation yet. It began with George activating a town-wide power outage, not just the business district this time, but the entire municipal grid. Simultaneously, the water main beneath the street adjacent to the town hall suffered a catastrophic rupture, another of William's precise manipulations, sending a geyser of water shooting 30 feet into the air and flooding the area around the building. As cartel members rushed to respond to these new crises, the veterans made their move. Michael and Victor, using the drainage culvert that ran behind the town hall, accessed the building's basement through a maintenance entrance that Frank had identified from his knowledge of the town's original construction. Deputy Martinez, in full uniform, created a distraction at the main checkpoint, drawing attention from their approach. Edwin's role was coordination and overwatch, his experience and strategic thinking more valuable than his physical presence in the direct action. From his position, using Robert's spotting scope, he monitored cartel movements and directed the team via radio. Inside the town hall, confusion erupted as the power failed and the sounds of rushing water penetrated the building. Mendoza, standing at the podium where he had been addressing the gathered townspeople, looked momentarily disoriented, his carefully orchestrated display of power undermined by this latest disruption. Father Gabriel and Dr. Wilson, seated on the stage as visible hostages, exchanged glances that contained a spark of hope. Throughout the room, cartel members moved with increasing urgency, receiving fragmented communications about multiple emerging crises across town. In the basement, Victor and Michael located the heating system maintenance room that provided access to a dumbwaiter shaft, a remnant from the building's original construction when coal was hoisted up to heat the main chambers. The shaft had been sealed decades ago but remained structurally intact behind a thin wall that yielded easily to Victor's pry bar. The narrow vertical passage provided access to a storage room adjacent to the main hall. From there, using the confusion of the power outage and water main break, they could approach the stage from behind, where Father Gabriel and Dr. Wilson were being held. Outside, the situation grew more chaotic as the water main break forced the evacuation of buildings on the adjacent block. Cartel members, already stretched thin by the previous night's disruptions, struggled to maintain control of multiple crisis points simultaneously. Edwin, observing through his scope, noted a critical development. Mendoza and his lieutenants were being moved toward the back exit, apparently preparing to retreat to the safety of the hacienda. This was an unexpected opportunity. Change of plan, Edwin transmitted. Primary target shifting to Mendoza. He's moving to the rear exit with minimal protection. Potential for leadership neutralization. Inside, Victor acknowledged and redirected their approach, moving not toward the hostages, who appeared to be less closely guarded as attention shifted to Mendoza's extraction, but toward the corridor leading to the back exit. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and decisive. As Mendoza and 3 bodyguards hurried down the darkened hallway toward the exit, they found their path blocked by Victor and Michael, 2 aging veterans who in that moment somehow reclaimed the deadly efficiency of their military prime. Victor, using his Marine hand-to-hand combat training, neutralized the first bodyguard before the man could raise his weapon. Michael, the former combat medic whose knowledge of human anatomy made him lethal in close quarters, disabled the second with a precisely delivered strike. The third bodyguard managed to fire a single shot that went wide in the darkness before being incapacitated by Deputy Martinez, who had circled around to cover the exit. Mendoza himself froze, suddenly finding his security detail eliminated and himself facing 3 aging but very determined veterans. "Luis Mendoza," Victor said, his voice steady despite the exertion, "you're being detained for questioning regarding criminal activities in Esperanza." Mendoza's composure cracked, disbelief evident in his expression. "You're the ones causing all this. A bunch of old men." "Not just old men," Michael corrected, securing Mendoza's wrists with zip ties. "Veterans." The distinction seemed lost on Mendoza as the implications of his capture began to register. Without their leader, the cartel's operations in Esperanza would falter. Without his connection to the larger organization across the border, the local operation would lose its legitimacy and protection. Outside, Edwin received confirmation of the successful capture. Package secured. Proceeding to extraction point. Simultaneously, Robert reported from the Peterson barn. Facility secured. Multiple detainees. Significant evidence documented and preserved. No casualties. Edwin allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Against all odds, their operation had succeeded. Mendoza captured. The distribution center secured. The hostages unharmed as cartel members, realizing something had gone terribly wrong, abandoned their posts in growing panic. But Edwin's military experience warned against premature celebration. The most dangerous phase of any operation was often the withdrawal, when success bred complacency and enemies grew desperate. "All units proceed to extraction points immediately," he ordered. "Maintain security protocols. This isn't over." As if to punctuate his caution, the radio crackled with an urgent transmission from George's monitoring position. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south. At least 4 SUVs, heavily armed personnel visible. Reinforcements from across the border. Edwin processed this development with the cold calculation of a combat veteran. The timing was problematic. Their forces dispersed between the town hall and the Peterson barn, Mendoza in custody but not yet secured at their fallback position, civilians still in potential danger zones. "Estimated time to arrival?" he asked. 10 minutes, maximum. Not enough time to complete all extractions and reach the fallback position. Decisions needed to be made, tactical triage prioritizing the most critical aspects of their operation. Victor, your team proceed with the package to the fallback position immediately. Robert, secure your position and prepare for potential engagement. All other units disengage and disperse according to Contingency Plan Echo. Contingency Plan Echo, developed for exactly this scenario, involved temporary disengagement, utilizing prepositioned civilian vehicles and identities to blend into the community while a minimal force secured key assets and detainees. Edwin started his truck and pulled away from his observation post, maintaining a casual pace to avoid drawing attention. As he drove, his mind raced through scenarios, calculating risks and contingencies with the precision that had once kept men under his command alive in the chaos of war. The reinforcements would focus first on securing Mendoza, but finding him missing would likely establish search parameters based on standard pursuit protocols. They would be looking for tactical movements, military-style operations, not an old man driving home from a shopping trip. Edwin took a circuitous route, passing through neighborhoods untouched by the recent disruptions, nodding to residents working in their yards or walking their dogs. The mundane normality of these scenes stood in stark contrast to the operation still unfolding across town. As he approached his property, Edwin noticed something that sent a chill through his aging bones. A black SUV parked half-hidden behind a stand of mesquite trees near his driveway. Not one of their vehicles. Not one he recognized from Mendoza's fleet. New players had entered the field. Edwin drove past his own driveway without slowing, continuing down the road as if heading elsewhere. In his rearview mirror, he saw movement, figures emerging from concealment around his property, attention focused on his passing vehicle. They'd anticipated his return home, had positioned an ambush, but they hadn't recognized him driving past in the unexpected vehicle. Edwin used the radio one final time. Eagle's Nest is compromised. Unknown hostiles in position. Proceeding to alternate roost. The alternate roost, a hunting cabin owned by Frank Delgado in the hills 20 miles outside town, would now become their fallback position. Not ideal, but the veterans had planned for compromise for adaptation. As Edwin navigated the back roads leading out of Esperanza, rain began to fall, light at first, then increasing to a steady downpour that reduced visibility and turned dirt roads to mud. In his military days, Edwin would have cursed such conditions. Now, he welcomed them. The rain would mask tracks, complicate pursuit, provide natural cover for their movements. Through the streams of water on his windshield, Edwin caught glimpses of Esperanza falling behind him, the town he'd called home for 60 years, the community he'd served as mayor, the place where Margaret was buried. For the first time in decades, he was retreating from a battlefield, withdrawing in the face of superior forces. But retreat was not defeat. Not when you carried with you the means to continue the fight. In the back of his truck, concealed beneath a tarp, lay 3 crates of documentation seized from the Peterson Barn financial records, distribution networks. Names and contacts that tied the local cartel operation to larger criminal enterprises across the border and beyond. Evidence that, in the right hands, could accomplish what rifles and tactical maneuvers never could. As he drove through the intensifying storm, Edwin's thoughts turned to what would come next. The capture of Mendoza and securing of evidence were significant victories, but the war for Esperanza was far from over. The cartel would regroup, reinforce, possibly retaliate against the town itself in frustration. The veterans had anticipated this phase too, had planned not just for the initial operation but for the extended campaign that would follow. They had prepared safe houses for civilians at risk, had established communication networks that would function even if traditional methods were compromised, had positioned resources and supplies for sustained resistance. Edwin Marshall had been 20 years old when he led men into combat against Nazi occupation in Europe. Now, at 88, he found himself once again a soldier in a war for liberation, different enemy, different terrain, but the same fundamental principles. Know your objective. Know your enemy. Know your capabilities. Adapt. Persevere. Never surrender what matters most. As lightning flashed across the darkening sky, Edwin allowed himself a grim smile. Mendoza and his cartel had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had seen old men and assumed weakness. They had counted their superior numbers and firepower as decisive advantages. They had failed to recognize what any student of military history understood, that battles are won by strategy, determination, and the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than oneself. Qualities that the veterans of Esperanza possessed in abundance. The radio crackled with George's voice, breaking through the static caused by the storm. All units report status. One by one, the veterans confirmed their positions. Victor and Michael had successfully transported Mendoza to the new fallback position. Robert, William, and Frank had secured the evidence from the Peterson barn and were proceeding to designated rendezvous points. George himself was maintaining communications while mobile, staying ahead of cartel attempts to locate their transmissions. All accounted for. No casualties sustained. Objectives achieved despite complications. Not bad for a bunch of old men, Edwin thought as he navigated the rain-slick roads toward the cabin that would become their new command post. Not bad at all. 3 days after the capture of Luis Mendoza, rain continued to fall over Esperanza and the surrounding hills, a blessing that had hindered cartel reinforcements and provided cover for the veterans' operations. Inside Frank Delgado's hunting cabin, transformed now into a command center, Edwin studied a topographical map spread across a rough-hewn table, the lamplight casting long shadows across his weathered face. They've established checkpoints on all major roads, Deputy Martinez reported, having just arrived with fresh intelligence. Approximately 60 personnel in total, split between town security and search operations. They're going house to house in certain neighborhoods, looking for you and Mendoza. Edwin nodded, marking the checkpoint locations on the map. And Sheriff Vega? Claiming no knowledge of our operations. Officially cooperating with the cartel while privately staying out of their way. He knows which way the wind is blowing. The cabin's main room had become a hive of focused activity. Victor and Michael maintained guard over Mendoza, who was secured in a back room. George continued to monitor communications, both cartel channels and official law enforcement frequencies. Robert and William sorted through the evidence seized from the Peterson barn, organizing it into categories that would be most useful for their next phase. Frank entered from outside, shaking rain from his poncho. Despite being the oldest at 91, he had insisted on maintaining the perimeter watch rotation. All quiet, he reported. No movement on the access road for 3 miles in either direction. Edwin gestured toward the coffee pot warming on the wood stove. Get warm, Frank. William will take next watch. As Frank poured coffee into a tin mug, Edwin considered their detainee. Mendoza had remained largely silent since his capture, refusing to engage beyond basic necessities. A professional's response, revealing nothing, waiting for rescue or opportunity. What's the status of our package for the federal authorities? Edwin asked. Robert looked up from his work organizing documents. Nearly complete. Financial records, distribution networks, corrupt officials, all documented and cross-referenced. Names, dates, amounts. Professional military intelligence standard. Edwin nodded with approval. Their objective had never been to defeat the cartel themselves, an impossible task for a handful of aging veterans, but to gather evidence sufficient to force federal intervention. The documentation from the Peterson barn, combined with Mendoza himself, created leverage that even compromised local authorities couldn't ignore. In our communications, George tapped his jury-rigged radio setup. Secure channel established with our contact at the DEA field office in El Paso. They're mobilizing based on our initial transmission, but need the complete package before committing major resources. Timeline. They've indicated a 24-hour window after receiving full documentation. Weather is delaying their aerial assets. Edwin absorbed this information, calculating variables against the deteriorating situation in town. The cartel's reinforcements, frustrated by Mendoza's capture and the seizure of their documentation, had responded with increasing aggression toward Esperanza's civilians, not yet widespread violence, but escalating intimidation. We can't wait that long, Edwin decided. The town is at risk of reprisals the longer this continues. Victor approached from where he'd been guarding Mendoza. We need to consider the possibility that the federal response will be delayed beyond their estimate. Bureaucracy moves slowly, even with solid evidence. Edwin's expression hardened. Then we accelerate their timeline. He outlined his adjusted strategy, a two-pronged approach that would simultaneously increase pressure on federal authorities while providing immediate relief to Esperanza. The veterans would divide into two teams. One to transport Mendoza and the documentation to a secure handoff point outside cartel control. The other to return to town and organize the community for self-defense until federal forces arrived. It's risky, Victor observed, studying the plan. Dividing our already limited numbers further reduces our tactical options. The greater risk is inaction, Edwin countered. Each hour Mendoza remains missing, the cartel grows more desperate. Desperate men make civilians suffer. The debate continued as evening fell, the veterans weighing options with the critical assessment of men who understood that in combat, there are rarely perfect choices, only varying degrees of calculated risk. By midnight, the decision was made. They would move at dawn. Edwin insisted on leading the team returning to Esperanza, despite objections about his age and the personal risk. Victor would head the team delivering Mendoza and the evidence, his Marine experience making him ideal for the extraction operation. As the others prepared equipment and reviewed routes, Edwin stepped outside onto the cabin's covered porch. The rain had lessened to a gentle patter on the roof, and occasional breaks in the clouds revealed stars scattered across the night sky. For the first time in days, Edwin allowed himself a moment of reflection. The campaign against the cartel had awakened something he'd thought long dormant, the tactical mind, the instinct for command, the clarity that came with purpose. His body might be limited by age, but his experience had proven more valuable than physical strength. He thought of Margaret, wondering what she would make of all this. She had known the soldier in him, had loved him not despite that part of his nature, but because of how he had channeled those skills into building rather than destroying after the war. Would she understand his return to the warrior's path? Edwin believed she would. The door opened behind him. Michael stepped out, a steaming mug in his hand. "Thought you could use this," he said, offering the coffee. "It's going to be a long day tomorrow." Edwin accepted with a nod of thanks. "How's our guest?" "Quiet. Calculating. I've seen his type before, weighing options, looking for leverage." Michael leaned against the porch railing. "He asked to speak with you, actually. First request he's made." Edwin considered this development. "Did he say why?" "No. But men like that don't ask for conversations unless they think they have something to gain." Edwin sipped his coffee, the bitter warmth a comfort against the night's chill. "I'll speak with him before we move out. He may have information that could help us navigate the situation in town." Michael nodded and returned inside, leaving Edwin alone with his thoughts once more. The conversation with Mendoza would be a dance of information and deception, each man seeking advantage. But Edwin had negotiated with enemy officers before, in the aftermath of villages liberated across France. He understood the language of power and pragmatism that transcended mere words. Dawn broke with lingering clouds but diminishing rain, favorable conditions for movement. The veterans made final preparations, distributing their limited weapons and ammunition, reviewing communications protocols, establishing rendezvous points should their teams be compromised. Before they departed, Edwin entered the back room where Mendoza was being held. The cartel leader sat on a simple cot, his hands secured before him, his expensive clothes now wrinkled and stained. Despite his circumstances, he maintained a posture of dignity. "You asked to speak with me," Edwin said, remaining standing. Mendoza studied him with calculating eyes. "You surprise me, Sergeant Marshall. I underestimated you and your colleagues." "A common error," Edwin replied, "confusing age with ineffectiveness. An error I won't repeat." Mendoza shifted slightly, wincing at stiff muscles. I assume federal authorities have been contacted. They have. Then let me offer you some insights that may prove valuable. Mendoza leaned forward. My organization is not simply a cartel. We have connections, financial, political, international. The men who have come to Esperanza in my absence are not under the same constraints I imposed. They do not share my preference for order over chaos. Edwin's expression remained neutral. Threatening civilians won't help your situation. Not a threat. A reality you should consider. Mendoza's voice lowered. The men currently in charge are not businessmen. They're enforcers. Their solution to problems is direct and final. Why tell me this? Edwin asked, though he suspected the answer. Because despite our differences, neither of us wants to see Esperanza destroyed. Mendoza straightened. I propose an arrangement. Contact my second-in-command, Javier. Tell him I'm alive and unharmed. Tell him I've ordered a stand-down of aggressive operations until my return. He will comply. Edwin considered the offer, weighing potential benefits against obvious risks. And in exchange, guarantee my delivery to federal authorities rather than local ones. The sheriff and certain state officials are on my payroll. They would ensure I never reach proper custody. A pragmatic proposal that aligned with their intentions anyway. Edwin nodded slowly. I'll consider it. Consider quickly, Sergeant. My absence creates a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum. Edwin left without further comment, rejoining the others for final preparations. He shared Mendoza's information, confirming their assessment of increasing danger to the town. As the first light of day strengthened, the veterans divided into their assigned teams. Equipment was distributed, weapons checked a final time, communications tested. These men had prepared for combat operations countless times before, in jungles, deserts, mountains across decades of American conflicts. Now they prepared once more. Not for country, but for community. Edwin's team, himself, Frank, Robert, and Deputy Martinez, would take the most direct route back to Esperanza, using their knowledge of back roads and terrain to avoid cartel checkpoints. Their objective was to reach Father Gabriel at St. Mary's Church, which could serve as both sanctuary and rally point for organizing the town's defense. Victor's team, including Michael, George, and William, would transport Mendoza and the documentation to the prearranged handoff point 30 miles east, where DEA agents would take custody. Their route was longer, requiring more navigation of potential cartel patrols, but their package was the mission's strategic centerpiece. Before departing, the veterans gathered in a circle outside the cabin, rain gear donned against the lingering drizzle. No grand speeches were made. These men had heard too many of those across too many deployments to be moved by rhetoric. Instead, Edwin simply met each man's eyes, one by one, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared purpose and mutual trust. Mind your corners, he said finally, using the old infantry admonition that had served them well in building-to-building combat. See you on the other side. The team separated, vehicles moving in opposite directions down muddy roads still shrouded in early morning mist. Edwin's truck, with Frank beside him and Robert and Martinez following in a second vehicle, wound through the hills toward Esperanza. The rain had rendered certain unpaved routes impassable, forcing them onto more established roads where cartel patrols might operate. As they approached the town's outskirts, Edwin slowed, studying the landscape ahead through binoculars. 2 cartel vehicles were visible at the intersection leading to the main highway, a checkpoint that hadn't existed the previous day. They're expanding their search perimeter, Martinez observed from the back seat. Getting desperate. Edwin nodded, altering their route to approach from the east instead, using an old cattle trail that would bring them to the rear of St. Mary's Church. The detour added time but avoided direct confrontation, a tactical choice prioritizing mission completion over engagement. The church came into view an hour later, its white bell tower rising above the surrounding buildings like a beacon. No cartel vehicles were visible in the immediate vicinity, though Edwin noticed increased patrols moving through adjacent streets. They approached cautiously, using buildings and vegetation for concealment. Father Gabriel himself opened the rear door, ushering them inside with evident relief. The church's basement had been transformed in their absence, cots arranged along the walls, supplies stacked in corners, a small medical station established in what had once been a Sunday school classroom. "We have 27 people sheltering here," Gabriel explained as he led them through the space. "Families who've been threatened, business owners who refused cartel demands, a few who simply had nowhere else to go." Edwin recognized many faces, longtime residents of Esperanza who had found themselves targeted as the cartel's frustration grew. Among them was John Powell, who had established an impromptu kitchen providing meals for the displaced. "The situation in town?" Edwin asked as they gathered in Gabriel's office. The priest's expression grew grave. "Deteriorating. The cartel has established a curfew. Anyone on the streets after dark is detained for questioning. They've occupied the town hall entirely, using it as their command center. Several homes have been searched, some vandalized when residents couldn't provide information about your whereabouts." Edwin absorbed this information, guilt and resolve intermingling. Their operation had indeed accelerated the cartel's aggression toward civilians, the risk they had identified but hoped to minimize. "What about communications with the outside?" Robert asked. "Phone lines? Internet? Restricted but not entirely cut off," Gabriel replied. "They're monitoring rather than blocking. Looking for information about Mendoza, I suspect." Edwin outlined their plan, organizing the community for protection while waiting for federal authorities to arrive. Not resistance or direct confrontation, but coordinated security measures to prevent further intimidation and victimization. Martinez, using his law enforcement credentials, would establish contact with state police to create a secondary channel for intervention if federal authorities delayed. Frank would organize the civilians sheltering in the church, creating security teams and evacuation protocols. Robert would establish observation posts to monitor cartel movements around town. Edwin himself would coordinate with community leaders who remained free to mobilize a broader response. "How long before the federal authorities arrive?" Gabriel asked. "If all goes according to plan, 24 to 48 hours, Edwin replied, knowing the estimate was optimistic. The priest nodded, understanding the unspoken qualification. "And if it doesn't?" Edwin met his gaze directly. "Then we hold until it does." The transformation of Esperanza had begun, from a town under siege to a community organizing its own defense. Edwin Marshall, who had once liberated villages across Europe, now applied those same principles to his hometown. The enemy was different, the weapons evolved, but the essential truth remained unchanged. Tyranny, whether imposed by foreign armies or criminal organizations, could only prevail when faced with submission rather than resistance. As darkness fell over Esperanza, lights began to appear in windows throughout town, not random illumination, but a signal arranged through whispered messages passed from house to house. Each light represented a household standing in solidarity, a silent defiance of the fear the cartel had sought to instill. From the bell tower of St. Mary's Church, Edwin observed this constellation of resistance spreading across the community he had served for so many decades. Whatever came next, federal intervention, cartel retaliation, further struggle, Esperanza had already begun its transformation. It had remembered something essential about itself, something that had nearly been forgotten during the months of gradual cartel infiltration. This town belonged to its people, and they had decided to take it back. The federal response, when it finally came, arrived with the dawn, black helicopters appearing over the eastern hills, convoy vehicles rolling into Esperanza from multiple directions. DEA, FBI, and Border Patrol agents moved with coordinated precision, securing the town hall and other cartel strongholds in a swift, overwhelming operation. Edwin watched from the church steps as cartel members were detained throughout town, their resistance minimal when faced with federal tactical teams. Victor's mission had succeeded, Mendoza and the evidence had reached the proper authorities, triggering the full-scale intervention that local corruption had previously prevented. The cartel's hold on Esperanza had been broken in less than an hour of federal action. What remained was the longer process of healing and rebuilding. 3 weeks later, Edwin sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and purple. His property showed signs of repair, workshop rebuilding underway, new security features installed, life returning to normal rhythms. Across town, similar restoration was visible, businesses reopening, families returning, community bonds strengthening through shared recovery. The veterans had been initially detained and questioned, then released with what amounted to unofficial commendations. Their actions, while technically outside legal parameters, had been recognized as necessary under the extraordinary circumstances. No charges would be filed. Their service, once again, had been accepted by a grateful nation. Victor approached up the driveway, moving with the slight limp that his Korean War injuries had left him. He carried a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. "Thought we could use this," he said, settling into the adjacent chair. "Doc says 1 drink won't kill us." Edwin smiled as Victor poured 2 modest glasses. "To absent friends," he offered as a toast. "And to Esperanza," Victor added. They drank in companionable silence as twilight deepened around them. "Federal presence will continue for at least 6 months," Victor noted. "They're establishing a permanent field office in the old bank building." Edwin nodded. "Long enough for proper foundations to be rebuilt. The town council election next month will help establish legitimate leadership." Several community members had already approached Edwin about running for mayor again, a notion he had politely but firmly declined. His service now would be that of mentor and advisor, not public official. The next generation needed to step forward. "Any regrets?" Victor asked after a while. Edwin considered the question, thinking of the risks taken, the violence unavoidable in such operations, the line between justice and vengeance they had carefully navigated. "No," he said finally. "Some sorrows, perhaps, but no regrets." Their conversation was interrupted by approaching headlights. Deputy Martinez, now acting Sheriff Martinez since Vega's arrest for corruption, pulled up in a patrol car. "Evening, gentlemen," he greeted them. "Just checking in. All quiet out here." "Peaceful as it should be," Edwin replied. Martinez nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "Town meeting tomorrow at 10. The FBI wants to discuss community policing initiatives going forward. Your insights would be valuable." After he departed, Edwin and Victor returned to their contemplation of the darkening landscape. Lights were appearing in homes across the valley below, families gathering for evening meals, children being tucked into beds without fear for the first time in months. "We won't see another war," Victor said quietly. "This was our last campaign." Edwin smiled, a certain peace settling into his bones. There are worse ways to conclude one's service than by defending home. The cartel's defeat was undeniable. Though some questioned the extent of the veterans' actions, most celebrated the powerful message sent. America does not bow to intimidation. Edwin, humble yet firm, quietly stepped back from the limelight, continuing duties without fanfare, steadfast in moral clarity. Their story stands as a testament to an enduring American truth, that genuine strength lies not in aggression but in preparedness, resolve, and the unwavering commitment to justice and liberty for all. What do you think about this incredible stand? Do you believe strength alone guarantees justice, or does real power lie in partnership, strategy, and bravery? Share your perspective in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping real-life stories of courage in the face of overwhelming odds.